In today's video, we're taking a look at some off-season NHL trade and free agent rumors concerning Claude Giroux and the likelihood of him ending up with the Ottawa Senators in the offseason. The Senators may not only be targeting Giroux, but also be taking a look at wild pending RFA Kevin Fiala. We could see some big moves from them this summer. Also, the future of Anthony Beauvillier in Long Island. Is he still a part of that core for the team moving forward, or will they consider trading him after a down season? The Seattle Kraken, also a team to be watchful for this offseason. With all the draft picks, it's bound that they use some of them towards actual players that can help them more immediately. Plus, we actually have two trades involving NHL clubs with minor league players. We have some more signings from the college free agent scene as well. All that coming up next. Well, welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we have a variety of NHL news and rumors. The rumors concern trades and free agency. We have a lot to cover here today, plus some updates from the NHL GM meetings taking place in person in Florida for the first time in the past couple years. Now, first up, we have a couple of actual trades to talk about here today. You might be asking yourself, why is that? The NHL trade deadline has gone by. Well, as we've talked about here recently, especially because of the Evgeny Dadonov situation with Vegas and that trade that was basically voided and canceled, trades can actually happen after the deadline. It just means that the players traded can't play in the NHL for the rest of the season. Now, these trades involve minor league players. Today was actually the AHL trade deadline to get their rosters in place for their upcoming postseason as well. So these players can't be recalled to the NHL for the remainder of the season because of that deadline that passed. But in the American Hockey League, they still were able to change teams up until today. We saw a deal involving the Boston Bruins trading Brady Lyle to the St. Louis Blues for future considerations. Clearly, they didn't see Lyles being a part of their future in either the NHL or AHL level, and gives them an opportunity to play with the Blues American Hockey League affiliate. And we also saw a trade involving the Hurricanes and the New York Rangers, with the Carolina Hurricanes trading Maxime Letunov to the Rangers in exchange for Termo Runanen. Now, Runanen actually has played NHL games this year. He played, I believe it was 4 games for the Rangers earlier this year, so a little bit surprised they would trade him right now, but obviously they have a pretty deep roster with a lot of prospects ahead of them on their depth chart, so not a huge shocker in that regard, but certainly these players will swap American Hockey League affiliate teams and get ready to compete for their playoffs here. So we'll see if those moves ever impact things at the NHL level. It's difficult to say at this point, probably unlikely, but trades can still take place, as I mentioned here, past the deadline. There's some college free agent signings to discuss here as well. The Penguins have signed undrafted college free agent defenseman Colin Sawyer is 23 years old. He comes from Michigan Tech. Certainly looks like a very interesting D-man. Obviously being 23 years old, the entry-level contracts are not 3 years. They get the shorter deals here, so they'll be hitting RFA status much sooner. And the Washington Capitals have signed themselves an undrafted goalie prospect. Clay Stevenson is actually originally from British Columbia. He's 23 years old. He gets a 2-year ELC. He played this past season in the NCAA for Dartmouth College. He's 6'4". Looks like a decent prospect, but it's hard to really tell sometimes what you're getting with these college free agents when they're 22, 23, 24 years old sometimes. Clearly they didn't get drafted, so they were, I guess you could maybe call them a little bit of a late bloomer. They weren't getting NHL scouts' attention, when they were 18, 19 years old. And sometimes, even if they have dominant seasons at that age, at those levels, you would expect them to be more dominant given their longer time that they've had to develop and their level of experience, etc. So we'll see if either of those guys ever become a factor at the NHL. But it's always this is the time of year when you see a lot of players leaving college and making the jump to the NHL level. Also, here we have some updates from the NHL general manager meetings. Of course, as we talked about before, one of the big topics this week is going to be long-term injury reserve and how the LTIR pool is used, whether or not they should implement a salary cap in the playoffs or what have you. But clearly, teams have been taking advantage of the, I guess you can call it a little bit of a loophole, if you will, when it comes to spending well above the salary cap. And in the case of Tampa Bay last year, I think part of what spawned this conversation today is not only because we're seeing LTIR used so much, but the Lightning, and especially Nikita Kucherov, just the way they spoke about it was almost like they were, kind of bragging about it, right? Which you understand Kucherov, the way he is, I wouldn't expect anything less. And certainly they were a great hockey team, but you don't want to see players miss an entire season and magically be available on game one, day one of the Stanley Cup playoffs. This is not really what you want to see. But at the same time, implementing a salary cap in the playoffs might be problematic. It's not really a clear-cut solution to how they do this, but there is different solutions being discussed, and see if they can't possibly work around so that things don't happen that way. They might even consider making a rule that contracts can't be traded if they're on long-term injury reserve, because you've seen teams purposely pick up contracts for the purpose of being able to spend more and increase their LTIR pool. That might be something that they look at here as well, because we've seen a fair bit of that over the last number of years as well. Another hot topic at the GM meetings today, according to NHL insiders, was officiating. Apparently, Kyle Dubas, no big surprise here, leads the Maple Leafs point of view here. That obviously a lot of concerns over officiating. Not a huge surprise that Austin Matthews hasn't really drawn a lot of penalties this year. We've often seen, a lot of situations involving being critical of the referees and the officials in Leaf games. Obviously, you want to make sure when you get to the playoffs that you're getting the calls that you feel that you need for your team to get an advantage, but you just want to see consistency, which is the biggest factor. One of the things they talked about with officiating as well was not just what's being called and, kind of creating a level playing field, make sure everything's consistent, but at the same time, that we're right now where they can review major penalties and drop it down to a 2-minute minor. They are also contemplating the possibility of having the referee to have the option of going from a major penalty to wiping out the penalty altogether. Right now, that is not an option. Once it's a penalty, it's going to be a penalty, but they can adjust how many minutes it is for. So we'll see if that gains any traction or what have you, but there have been some times when, whether it's a friendly fires like the wrong stick, or, you get a case where, after having a second look at it, maybe you could argue it shouldn't have been a penalty. I've seen a few scenarios like that pop up. I'm not really sure there's enough of it, though, and anything real major that I'm not sure how much traction that's going to get, but it is certainly something that is being heavily discussed. The other thing that was being discussed as well is that the next couple of years' worth of events and critical dates likely could be released by the NHL well in advance. So obviously, we're looking at, normally you don't get dates for like 2 years out when it comes to, like special events like the Winter Classic and who's going to host and an All-Star game and, like the NHL draft. Usually we don't get that far ahead, but they had been planning to do stuff like that to have a further kind of planned out calendar of events a couple of years out pre-pandemic, but of course that threw everything for a loop, and we're kind of getting back to that now. So we'll see. We should get a lot more details on that soon here, and we should have a lot more information coming out over the next few days as well. Now, when it comes to the rumor section of the video here today, one of the teams we want to look out for to be a major player in NHL trades and making some moves here, especially ahead of the NHL draft, not to mention free agency, but more so the draft or leading into it, would be our new franchise, the 32nd team, the Seattle Kraken. We've seen them make a lot of trades ahead of the deadline, shift off a lot of players out of the organization in return for future draft capital. They have a lot of picks going into the future, and they need some pieces for players that can help today. Clearly, a lot of the players they took in the expansion draft, they signed a few of them as free agents. They've re-upped some of them, like Jared McCann, got a new contract. And they have a few of their defensemen, like they signed Larson, Alexiak. They got Grubauer, Jaden Schwartz. They really don't have a lot of guys signed long-term, which makes sense being a newer franchise. And a lot of what they drafted has not worked out and has been traded. I mean, there's still a fair bit there, but, Giordano's gone and a number of other guys. So, certainly the Kraken need players that can help today. So it's been certainly speculated and talked about here that the Kraken should be a team that you see be very, very active and use some of those draft picks to pick up probably some younger players. I'm going to say players that they would target ideally would be guys that either have a little bit of term, maybe a pending RFA that a team might struggle to sign, something along those lines would be your ideal players for them to target. Ideally probably 25 and under, who can be a big part of the team for the longer stretch here. So certainly look for Seattle to be very active ahead of the draft. Now, one player that makes sense for them to target, and I don't have any, rumors or anything, reports to suggest that they've, do have interest per se, but I do see reports from New York Hockey Now really talking about the future of the Islanders franchise and what moves we might expect from them, and the future of Anthony Beauvillier, who's certainly a younger player, still, approaching his mid-20s, having a bit of a down season, only has 10 goals, has a couple of years left, around $4 million. A couple of years back, you could say he was really building upon to be a big part of the team's core for the future, along with guys like Matthew Barzal, as, guys that are a little bit older, like your Anders Lee, Josh Bailey, etc., start to get a little older, and kind of you see the team shift and the leadership of the group shift. But it hasn't really worked out for him. I mean, he scored some big goals in the playoffs for them over the last 2 runs, but this has really been, and he's not the only one. You could lump several Islander players into the category of having an atrocious season here. Some guys started off really bad, but have been good as of late. Kyle Palmieri is a prime example of that. Certainly finally starting to earn his contract. But you have to think that Lou Lamoriello is going to be making some moves. We've heard Lou speak in a number of interviews here recently, kind of doubling down on the fact that he still very much believes in his team. But at the same time, we've heard him say that there's several players on his team that have not lived up to what their expectations are based on their contract and what we know they're able to do and how they're able to perform, and that's not acceptable, and that there should be some changes coming. He didn't really elaborate exactly what, but for the most part, thinks a lot of these guys can bounce back, and he believes in this group, which, is good for him to say, to give them some good confidence, but at the same time, that there needs to be some change. I think they need a little bit of salary cap flexibility. I think it is quite probable that a guy like Beauvillier goes for a couple of reasons, even though he's younger, and you might want to think, well, maybe they should move some of the older guys. That makes sense too, but at the same time, you got to trade somebody who has value. Like, you might have to attach a guy like Anthony Beauvillier to a guy like Josh Bailey in order to move them both. I mean, Josh Bailey is a player who's been with the Islanders a long time, very loyal soldier, done a lot of good things for them over the years, but certainly another guy who's had a really rough season, and many Islanders fans, I think, feel it's quite likely to, impossible that it's time to move on. I mean, we know that some players like Bailey, for example, were exposed in last summer's expansion draft. So I think it's definitely a scenario that Lou and the Islanders are willing to move on without him here. They wouldn't have exposed him if that wasn't the case. It was down to Bailey and Eberle were the 2 main players that the Islanders left open for Seattle. They went with Eberle. Didn't go with Bailey, but could Eberle end up there anyways? You have to wonder. Seattle's a team with a lot of salary cap space, like I mentioned, even though they have some picks that could make a trade. Could they be interested in Beauvillier? Maybe they want Beauvillier. They'll take the rest of Bailey in order to get Beauvillier. Maybe they give up a lot less of a price tag. I mean, that's just like I said, there's no linkage there between those 2 teams. That's just speculation on my part, but it makes sense here that those would be the 2 prime forwards that Lou would probably try to move. And even though Beauvillier is younger and very well could bounce back, you have to give up something of value to get something better. You do expect the New York Islanders to likely be all in on a couple of the top pending free agents, or possibly some of the players that are, most likely to be traded. Islander reporters like Nichols and Gross talking about the fact that Jacob Chychrun is probably a very prime target of the Islanders heading into this offseason. Now, the Islanders are going to have a lot of competition in that regard. I'm not 100% convinced they have the assets to make that kind of trade with the Coyotes. It does appear that the trade price might have dropped here a little bit, but we'll see what they're up against this offseason. Otherwise, guys like Johnny Gaudreau, Philip Forsberg, if they hit free agency, you have to think that Lou is going to be all over that, even if they have to overpay a little bit. They desperately need another top offensive players to add to that top 6. They're probably, to give that team some more scoring, to kind of re-energize or reignite Matthew Barzal, who's certainly, not having a terrible season. I think if you look at his numbers, they're not horrific by any means, but I think there's still, another level that he can find at this point in the year. He looks a little bit disinterested. Probably, a lot of players kind of lose focus a little bit once playoffs are out of reach. So we'll see what happens. But Beauvillier's future in Long Island is certainly up for debate. Adding him to a guy like Josh Bailey might be what it takes to make a trade to move them out, to get the cap flexibility they desperately need to go after a much higher end talent to balance things out and get this team back on track for next year. Now, as I mentioned, we also have some latest rumblings around Claude Giroux, of course, who was just traded to the Florida Panthers, but there's a lot of talk on what is next for Giroux in the offseason. He's a pending unrestricted free agent. Obviously, he has some big decisions to make, and a lot of those decisions might be based more so on how the rest of the season goes. But, of course, we saw reports recently in the Ottawa Sun from Bruce Garriock indicating the interest between Giroux and the Ottawa Senators. That is very intriguing for him to consider the possibility of coming home to play, near home for him. And obviously his former teammate in Philly, Kimmo Timonen, who obviously was around Giroux for the 1,000th game celebration, has a podcast which is conducted in Finnish, but it was translated by Philadelphia media, talking about the whole thing around Giroux and what his thoughts are. And he himself said that Claude Giroux was very upset after the game was over and the celebration, as much as he enjoyed it all, that he basically cried over a beer and kind of didn't really want to leave. But it's a business, that's tough. But I know there was some reports before saying that he could resign in Philly in the offseason. There were some reports that said that was part of the issue, that he wanted to strike a deal with Chuck Fletcher, that they could sign a new contract in the offseason, and he might be more flexible on where he's traded to, and then change his mind because Philly wouldn't work with him on that. That doesn't appear to be true. I've heard a variety of reports and on that, and I'm not convinced that was actually the case. But I do know, based on what Kimmo Timonen said, that he also says that he confirmed that playing in Ottawa is extremely intriguing to Giroux, especially if he gets that Stanley Cup in Florida this year. It'll likely become that much more likely, but even if he doesn't, it's not a guarantee. Now, could he sign another short-term contract in Florida if he really likes it there and they come close and he thinks that window is still open? Sure, it's a possibility. Maybe he stays for another year. I don't know, but basically with the fact of Giroux being from the area, having lots of family there. His wife is from the area. It seems like he wants to retire there. Obviously having a young child is, something that they're going to consider as well, where they're going to want him to go to school and where he's going to want to be raised and all those things as well. So, sometimes family comes before hockey at the end of the day, and he seems to be really intrigued by the idea of finishing up his career at home. Of course, the Ottawa Senators are a team that's coming out of the rebuild, and he also mentioned that was very intriguing to him with all the young talent they have there. So could we see a scenario where Giroux does end up, having success in Florida, gets his name on the Stanley Cup, but then comes back to the Senators in the offseason and signs a free agent contract? I would not rule it out. Now, another player that the Senators reportedly have interest in as well, there's a dating back to before the NHL trade deadline, is Wild pending RFA Kevin Fiala. As much as the Minnesota Wild would probably like to keep Kevin Fiala, they are facing a salary cap crunch, and I've seen many NHL reporters indicate that the possibility of Fiala being traded this offseason is actually pretty good because of it. They're going to have a real difficult time getting him under contract. So if they can get some good asset returns from a team like the Senators, who are loaded with prospects and draft picks, it makes a lot of sense. The Sens are going to be picking high in the first round. Maybe instead of making a selection, they make a big trade and bring in a top young player like Fiala. That would not be shocking at all. So even though the Sens have had a down season here, which is not what we expected this year. We didn't expect them to necessarily get into the playoffs, but we expected more growth for sure. Adding a couple of dynamic players like that, plus they just signed Jake Sanderson, who was their number 5 pick in the 2019 NHL draft. Obviously, that's a lot of talent being added to a lineup. They've had nothing but injuries this year. Shane Pinto missing extended time. Obviously, Josh Norris missed a bunch of time. Batherson missed a bunch of time. They all had big bouts of COVID early on. This team has faced so much adversity this year. They really don't know what it's like to have a full team. So if they can get their full team back, add a couple of these big pieces, you can see a completely different team next year and have a much more competitive environment. So we'll see where things go, but certainly some potential big moves in store for the Senators this offseason. Let me know your thoughts on everything discussed here today down in the comments. We'll discuss further. If you're new to this channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with all the latest news, rumors, and analysis of all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.